Hey, what's going on, guys? In today's video, we're gonna show you guys how to trim a brisket so that you can have the best brisket you possibly can. I think most people underestimate how important it is to trim a brisket before you cook it. If it's too thin, it's gonna dry out. If it's too fatty, your brisket is gonna taste greasy and it's not gonna cook properly. So the biggest reason to focus on the trim is, as you guys can see, this brisket is a very uneven cut of meat. And also includes two different muscles. We have this big chunk right here. This is kind of like the deckle or the point, which is like the more marbled section. And then it tapers off into this really thin section, which is called the flat, which is a much leaner cut. And in order for us to cook this properly and make sure it cooks evenly throughout a long 12 to 14 hour cook, we wanna kind of get this as uniform as possible. Even though this is kind of like a restaurant quality type of trim, and a lot of people will say like we're cutting off way too much, but even as a home cook, in order for you to be able to serve the entire thing and get the best slices you possibly can for your family and friends, the restaurant trim is kind of like the best trim for the backyard at home as well. A lot of people use different types of knives. Some people even use like carving knives because it has a longer blade. I like using this 6-inch curved bony knife. This is a Knox knife. I've been using a knife like this for years, and it's nice and nimble. So on these weird sections of the brisket where you're trying to get really clean cuts, it helps a lot. Also, I like the curved blade because I can get really nice clean cuts and nice clean strokes while I'm trimming this brisket up. And they're cheap, very cheap. So for the first section, the first part of this brisket is we're gonna take out that ginormous heel fat that we're talking about. With this section, you can kind of get your finger underneath it and kind of peel it back a little bit. So if you can, try to use your hands to do so. And there's almost a seam that is happening in between there. And so once you can pull it back and find that seam, you're just gonna use the tip of your knife and just kind of scrape it down. And you can kind of, as you're pulling it, you can kind of hear it tearing just a little bit. And the further and further you can get your fingers down there, just peel it back, use that tip of the knife. And there we go. And then once you can kind of get underneath there, you can kind of see where this heel fat meets the brisket. Turn your knife, and again, continue to just use the tip of your knife to peel it all back. This thick piece of fat right here, it's really thick, so it's not gonna render, and it's also actually gonna affect the way our brisket cooks in this section, just because it's so insulated with that fat. So it's very important to take this piece out. The fat that's covering this entire bottom piece is very unusual, and as you guys can see, it is quite thick, and we definitely don't want all that fat in the bottom of our brisket. But in order to do it so that we're not fraying our brisket, and we want it to become really nice and smooth, because any rough edges or any sharp parts on your brisket are most likely dry and burn up, and we don't want that at all. So the best way to do it is on the very edge of this brisket, we can kind of see the way that the grain of the muscle is going. And as I can see these small little lines, I can see that the muscle fibers are going at an angle this way. And so as I trim this top portion off, I want to go in that same direction because it's going to help us get really nice clean cuts. So anything that you can lift up, definitely take off with your hands, kind of like we did with the heel fat. All right. So again, kind of like we did with the heel fat, we want to be able to go underneath it. Don't cut too deep though. Again, the way that I'm cutting, I'm going with the grain of the muscle. But as you guys can see, this fat it's kind of pillowy, which kind of helps us to pull it back a little bit. Whenever you can, just use your hands to peel it back so that you can reduce the chances of cutting into the meat. So typically for a brisket, I like to find a brisket that's in between the weight of, I would say like a 13 to 16 pound brisket. Generally within that weight range, it allows that usually the brisket is a little bit more even and more uniform in size. And it also generally tells me that it's gonna cook a little bit better and a little bit faster. If you get briskets that are too large, or they're 20 pounds, 25 pounds, one is gonna take forever to cook. And also there's a lot more fat in those kind of briskets, and they're just not gonna have as much brisket to serve. All All right, so as we can see, we're getting close to the bottom of this brisket. Now that we're getting close enough to where we can actually see the grain of the muscle, there are these still pockets of fat that we want to get off, because if we leave these chunks of fat on here and let's say at some point during the cook our fire gets a little bit too hot, these parts can get really crispy and kind of get charred up. So later on when you go to serve your brisket and you're trying to slice it, these parts are going to be really hard and start to almost shred your slices a little bit. So we wanted to make sure again that we get this as clean as possible, because everything that we're trying to do is thinking about the end product and making sure that every slice that we get is super smooth. So when you get these parts where it's a little bit harder, I like to lift it, I have my hand underneath and lift it up. And instead of using a really short sawing motion, I like to start my knife at the base and use the entire length of the blade to get these long kind of like pieces off so it's nice and smooth. So again, this portion right here, using the base of the knife and use the entire length of the blade. You can also pick this piece up and just kind of push with your knife. Lift up and just push with your knife. Right here, I think we're pretty good. We got all that really thick fat off. We can see kind of the marbling of our brisket. We can see the grain of our brisket. Some of these parts are a little thinner. We can probably take a little more off. And I think we are good to go in the bottom. So again, with the bottom of our brisket, the two things that we want to do is take off that big chunk of that heel fat, just because it's not gonna render and it's gonna mess up the slices on this side, and then get as much fat off and then as much silver skin on the bottom as possible and make it super clean. Right here on the lean portion, we got most of this fat and this like the chunky silver skin, the fat off. And here, as we get moved on top of the brisket, this is where that deckle and that marbled portion is. So having a little bit more fat here is just going to happen, and that's what we kind of want on this side. We're going to take off a little bit more fat here so we can have a flatter surface. And there you go. I just took off that part so that later on when we flip the brisket, it'll lay down a lot flatter instead of having this little piece that's going to lift this brisket up. Now that we got the bottom of our brisket trimmed and cleaned up, this is where a bulk of the work is going to happen, and the bulk of the work in terms of shaping it and taking off any uneven pieces of our brisket. The first thing that we're going to start off is with taking down our hump or our mohawk that we talked about before. So for me, I like to do it where I like having the hump or the mohawk facing towards me or the deckle towards my direction, because I want to be able to create a big cut that's going to be nice and clean and push like I did when I was cleaning down the bottom. So this brisket is a lot different than briskets I've trimmed before. It's a lot bigger and a lot wider, and you can see this giant kind of flap of meat that's on the side right here. And this again is why it's super important that we trim the brisket properly. This portion right here is super lean. Doesn't have that much fat on top of it, and if we leave this on and we cook it for 12 to 14 hours, there's almost no chance this brisket is going to be worth eating. So we're going to definitely taper this down. So I'm going to pull, I like to pull and stretch my brisket on all sides just because I want to get an idea of how big and how wide my brisket actually is. And from there, I want to trace a line with my knife going down this way. It gives me an idea of how big, how wide my brisket is going to be at the end. So from here, now that I got traced that line, make sure you measure twice just in case. And then from here, taking this all the way down. And once we do that, it's going to kind of give us an idea of how thick that lean is underneath. And then it's going to also show us how much marbling we have underneath here as well. So like one of the reasons again is we're taking off all this meat that we can't serve, but it's also going to give us an idea of like how much marbling and how much fat we need to trim off on the rest of this brisket. Now the next part that we see here, this is like the hump and the mohawk section. Once we took all that off, you can see that this is another big chunk of fat that's really going to affect our cook, and it's really not going to be worth serving at all. For that reason, we are also going to shave this down. So I want to take my knife and put it at an angle about here and have it cut all the way down to where the flat and the point meet. So up to this section, I want to take that slight angle, and almost create a new kind of rounded shape for my brisket. Again, you're using the full length of your blade and you're pushing. And if you guys have seen a bunch of briskets from like Texas barbecue restaurants, you've kind of seen this cut, you've kind of seen this shape, and now you can see that it's a lot more uniform going across. And that's what we're looking for. It's gonna help us for our brisket to cook faster, it's gonna help the brisket cook a lot more evenly, and it's gonna make sure that every single slice that we have is servable to a customer. So at this point, we took the mohawk down, and now we're really trying to figure out what is the shape of my brisket gonna be. Because right now you can see how long it is, and it's a little strange, but also this portion of our brisket, this lean, kind of tapers off and it's super, super thin. And we definitely don't want that. But if we look on the opposite side of this lean, it's a lot thicker. And so we want to cut off and round off a portion to make sure that the entire lean section has an even thickness, and it's gonna help us cook this brisket a lot more evenly. So as I look at this brisket, I wanna figure out like where is it thick enough for me to start trimming it off. And I'm looking for probably somewhere between a half an inch to an inch thickness on that lean, and that's telling me it's roughly about here. So this is kind of where I know that my brisket will last to cook, but anything past that will most likely be way too thin and it's gonna dry up. So from here, where I found that I said to myself, this is thick enough, I'm gonna take my knife and I'm gonna go at a slight angle and we're gonna cut all this off right here. So this seems like it's a lot of waste, but this really won't last in the brisket cook. You can use it for sausage making in restaurants. We make it for burgers. If you guys don't have a meat grinder at home, you can put it in chilies and things like that. So it's also good meat. It just won't be good for brisket cooking in this way. So at this point, it's starting to take shape, and we had that really wide, really ugly brisket. We had that lean that was stretched out really wide. We had that lean that was really thin, and now everything generally has the right thickness that we're looking for all around. But the other thing that we have to clean up is there's a lot of sharp edges on this brisket. So as I pull off that portion up top where we took off that hump, we have this portion right here that is definitely way too thin and it's just fat, so we want to trim that off. Any sharp corners that we have on these briskets that we made these really sharp cuts where there are these corners, those corners are going to dry up and burn as well. So anything that's kind of sticking up or stretching out, we want to round off and kind of give like a shape, like it's almost like a shoe, where it has a really rounded heel, and this is kind of like the toe box of your shoe, and we want to make sure it's nice and smooth on all edges of it. So we're going to start off with this top portion, and we just want to take this off, and we're just creating a new surface for our brisket. Take that off, and then again, just kind of pull up with your hand. If there's anything that sticks off, again, we're just rounding it off. Talking about these corners where I lean, I'm gonna push it out as much as I possibly can. And some people are really good about having really nice knife skills where they can just go and round it and have it be really smooth. But for those of you guys who are maybe new to trimming briskets or just maybe aren't as comfortable taking those kind of moves, I would recommend taking off corners. This is how I used to train guys in barbecue restaurants, where if you have the sharp corner, you're just gonna take off that corner, which creates these two smaller corners, and you're gonna take off that, you're gonna take off that, and with those three cuts, now you kind of have a new rounded shape. So if you don't feel comfortable with that, don't worry about it, just take it off, just take off those corners. And just to show you guys again, take off this corner, and then take off these two smaller corners. And now, like, you can see your brisket has this really nice rounded shape where it's not gonna catch air. There's no edges that are gonna get discolored or dried out or burned just because we left those corners on there. Let's move over to the side of the deckle or the point. Generally, this side is naturally more rounded, but there are still these little sharp corners here. There's a little bit more fat that we can probably trim off down here. And so again, we just want to create a really nice rounded shape. So this corner, Come here and round it off. And when I'm trimming kind of like this deckle at this point, I like to think about it like you're trying to take off a peel off of an orange, or you're like supreming citrus or something like that. You're kind of starting at the top and you're working your knife around and then rounding it so you can create this shape that's not going to catch air. It's really nice and smooth. It's going to give your brisket a nice presentation. So again, we're going to start here, rounding it off, and nice clean cut that way. Again, just keep pulling and yanking on anything, and you guys will see that there's still stragglers. We just wanted to make it look pretty. So the very last thing that we're going to try to do, now that we took all the excess, we're happy with the shape, probably the biggest issue that most people have with trimming brisket is taking off that layer of fat that exists on top. Just because it's a little bit uneven, some portions of your brisket are really thick, other parts of it are really, really thin. But I'm gonna show you guys a trick to help you guys determine where you need to cut more fat off of and other portions that you can just leave as is. So on this portion of our lean, it's quite thick and I can feel it. Like this portion is nice and pillowy, it's thin, but as I move to this section, it's a lot thicker. Like I can leave my fingerprint in there, and that's definitely telling me I need to take some more fat off. But when you're trying to decide how much you need to take off and you're scared that you're gonna end up taking all the fat off, I learned this trick from one of my old bosses, Leonard at Truth Barbecue. He takes his two fingers, like his index finger and his thumb, and he kind of rakes his hands across this brisket. And as you do that, you kind of create this groove. And that right there, everything that's sitting on top, that's all fat that we can trim off of it. If I were to do that on the center portion, there's a small groove, but not so much that I'm worried that it's gonna be too much. So from here, I'm gonna start with the base of my knife, and I know that all this right here is good to come off. And I'm gonna, again, use the entire length of my knife as much as possible, and I'm gonna grab this kind of tail to take off this entire layer of fat. And this is going to definitely take a lot of practice, because if you let it warm up way too much, this fat is going to be really, really hard to cut through. So again, we're going to use our fingers to rake our fingers across, find the tail, and take off that fat. And then you're just going to just keep doing that until you can't really catch any more fat, or it doesn't create those grooves anymore. And that's going to give us an idea of having a really nice and even, not too thick fat cap that's going to render really well, and it's going to kind of give us that like nice sweet fat on top of our brisket. Sometimes you'll get brisket where it's a little bit too thick and it doesn't render properly, and it's that fat that looks really white when you slice into it, and it doesn't give you that smoky sweet flavor. It just kind of tastes greasy. And when you have too much fat on your brisket is also going to kind of taste a little bit under seasoned, just because when you have more fat, you kind of need to add more salt. But if you leave too much, you run the risk of over salting your food. So it's just much easier to make sure that you trim it properly, get that even layer of fat all the way across, and that's going to help you create that really sweet fat that you're looking for on a smoked brisket. All right, so I think we're done. I'm just gonna do one final check, kind of, and stretch out all the sides of the brisket just to see if there's anything that's still lingering, any pieces that need to come off. This corner is poking out just a little bit, so I'm gonna round that just a little bit more. And that's pretty good. So now we got a lean section that's thin as it was earlier. Like, it's a nice thickness, and it's gonna cook really well. Nothing's gonna dry out as long as we keep control of our temperature. Our fat has a really nice thickness right here, so it's gonna render really nicely and give us that sweet fat, especially with a lot of that smoke and the salt and the black pepper that we're gonna add later. And the whole point is to make sure we took that really big, ugly piece of brisket and create it into a uniform shape to where it's gonna be cooked nice and even. So if we look at our height of our brisket as it is now compared to before, like, it's pretty uniform from end to end, and that's what we're looking for. All right, so after we trimmed up our briskets, there is a lot of trim, but none of it's gonna go to waste. We have all this meat right here that can be used mostly for sausage, for barbecue restaurants. You can do them for burgers. Some of this thinner fat that we talked about earlier, this is great for running down to make tallow to cook with or for anything else that you may need. And then this big chunkier fat that's great for grinding and putting into other leaner cuts if you want to make your own like burger blends, or this is the stuff that I always reserve for making sausage because it has a great texture when you grind it up in the same way that you do with your raw beef.
Subscribe to our channel and visit ChefSteps.com for more tips, recipes, guides, and tools to help you level up in the kitchen.